This video is based on coordinate geometry of the line. In particular, it's looking at coordinate geometry of the line worksheet number 4, and it's based around the slope of the line. And this video is an introduction to the slope of the line, and it looks at what the slope tells us. So the slope tells us two things. So first of all, it tells us whether the slope goes uphill, downhill. Now, if we draw a coordinate plane and draw a line on a coordinate plane, so if we draw one in red, one in blue, and then we might go for one in green. So in English, we read from left to right, and it's the same in maths. We also read from left to right. So if we look at the red line, we can tell straight away if that line is going uphill or downhill. So reading from the left to the right, we can see that that slope is definitely going uphill. And if a slope is positive, it's always going uphill. So then this slope for the red line is positive. If you take the blue line and you read the blue line from the left to the right, you can see straight away that that line is definitely going downhill. And when we have a slope that's downhill, it's a negative slope. And finally, we have the green line here. And the green line, when you read that from left to right, it's definitely going uphill. And when a line goes uphill, it's definitely positive. So the first thing is the slope tells us about a line is whether it's going uphill or downhill, which in turn tells us whether it's a positive or negative number. So the second thing a slope does is it tells us how steep the line is. And the key thing to remember about this is the larger the number, the steeper the line. So here we have two lines. We have line A and we have line B. So line A has a slope of 3, and you can see that when we read it from left to right, that's quite a steep uphill that we have there. And line B has a slope of 1/4, so a slope of 1/4. And when you read that line from left to right, you can see that although it is going uphill, it's not going uphill as steep as line A. So lines A and B have positive slopes, so that means they're both going uphill. So here we have another two examples. So we have line C and we have line D. So line C has a slope of -1/3 and line D has a slope of -2. So if you read these slopes from left to right, you can see straight away that they're both going downhill, and you can see that slope C, which is -1/3, is much less steep than slope D, which is -2. So just to recap, so lines C and D have negative slopes, so that means they go downhill. The number for line C is 1/3 and the number for line D is 2, so this means that D is much steeper than line C. So a few example questions that we might have for this would be, state whether each of the following has a positive or negative slope. So how we do that is we read from left to right. So for example, A here, we have to read from left to right and it's going uphill. And if it's going uphill, that means it has a positive slope. In B here, we read again from left to right, and when we read from left to right, we can see that it is going downhill, which means we have a negative slope. Another type of question we could have is where they might give you a few slopes and they would ask you to list the slopes from steepest to least steep. So this is actually quite an easy question because we just have to list them in order of steepness. So we have to go from steepest, so the line that is the steepest, to the line that is the least steep. And if you look at all of these here, well, C is definitely the steepest. So C comes first. Then D is not as steep as C, but it is still quite steep. Then E comes next, and then F is after that. So that's how you do that example. It's quite a hopefully easy question that you would have. So state whether each of the following has a positive, negative, or zero slope. So that's one key thing we need to look at just before you go and do these questions. So a zero slope. So if we have a zero slope, that means it's not going uphill or downhill, so it's completely flat. So any line that's completely flat has a zero slope. Otherwise this question should be perfectly fine. It's very similar to example number 1, so it's just figuring out if it has a positive, negative or zero slope. So remember that if it is positive, it would be going uphill, and if it was negative, it would be going downhill. This question here says the diagram shows the 4 lines A, B, C and D, and it just wants you to identify the positive slope and which is negative slope. That should be easy enough. The third question then says the diagram shows 3 lines A, B and C, and it just wants you to match the slope. So remembering that the steepest slope has the biggest number. So the steepest slope, so the one that's going uphill the most, I wouldn't say the most, I should say the fastest. So the slope that is going uphill the fastest is the steepest. And finally, question 4 says the diagrams show 4 lines L, M, N and K. Explain why the slopes are negative. So remembering that uphill equals positive and downhill equals negative. And then the final thing it wants you to do is just match the lines with the slopes. And that is the end of the first video on slope of the line. I'm hoping that it made sense. If there's any problems, you can get in contact with me.